In the autumn of 1978, CIA operative Thomas Hale entered the Soviet Union under a forged British passport, using the name Richard Coleman. His mission appeared routine. Meet a Soviet engineer willing to trade information about a new radar system, collect the material, and quietly leave through Helsinki within 3 days. Hale had completed similar assignments in Eastern Europe for nearly a decade. Nothing suggested that this time would be any different. Yet from the moment he stepped off the plane at Sheremetyevo, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. The airport patrols lingered too long. The passport inspection took nearly 10 minutes, and Hale later wrote in a coded message that he felt the distinct pressure of eyes following him. His last confirmed appearance occurred on October 17th, just after 9 in the evening. He was seen walking near Kitaygorod metro station, coat collar raised against the cold Moscow wind, carrying a small leather briefcase. A single blurry photograph from a street surveillance experiment, one of the few in the USSR at the time, captured him mid-step. The next frame, taken seconds later, showed only an empty square. There were no witnesses, no commotion, no signs of struggle. Hale had vanished silently, as if the city itself had swallowed him. When he failed to check in, the CIA initiated a rapid review. At first, they suspected a standard arrest, but the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued an unexpected statement. They denied having detained anyone resembling Hale. The tone of the note was unusually firm, almost defensive, as if someone within the Soviet structure wanted to distance themselves from the event. What unsettled the agency even more was Hale's reputation. He was disciplined, cautious, and intimately familiar with Soviet counterintelligence methods. He knew which streets avoided surveillance, which safe houses were compromised, and how to blend into a foreign city. For an operative of his caliber to disappear without a trace felt impossible. Rumors emerged inside the CIA that Hale might have defected. Others suggested that an unauthorized KGB subdivision had taken him, operating independently of official structures. Washington quietly monitored Soviet diplomatic flights, hoping to spot any sign of a covert prisoner transfer. They found nothing. What no one in the West knew was that, on the night Hale disappeared, the KGB activated an internal directive, known only as Protocol 7. It was used rarely, reserved for cases involving matters considered too dangerous to be handled through official channels. Within hours, a confidential file labeled Subject H-17 began to grow inside the Lubyanka building. Pages were added in secrecy, stamped with classifications so strict they bypassed even many senior officers. Hale's disappearance would trigger a quiet storm inside both intelligence services, but for years the truth remained buried. And inside the KGB, those who knew the details understood one thing clearly. The Americans would never be told what had really happened that night. In the months that followed Thomas Hale's disappearance, the CIA pushed every remaining contact in Eastern Europe, hoping for even the faintest clue. But intelligence coming out of the USSR was strangely uniform. No arrests, no interrogations, no rumors among Moscow's diplomatic circles. It was as if Hale had never entered the country at all. Yet inside the KGB, a very different story was unfolding, one that would remain sealed for nearly 4 decades. Newly declassified reports reveal that Hale had been under surveillance long before his forged passport was stamped at Sheremetyevo. KGB agents in Vienna had marked him weeks earlier after observing several unusual meetings with 2 Austrian businessmen suspected of collaborating with Western intelligence. Instead of intervening abroad, the KGB chose patience, quietly tracking him across borders and preparing Moscow for his arrival. The KGB had a specific reason for taking such interest. Earlier that year, Soviet military engineers had reported a series of unauthorized attempts to access documents about a new, long-range radar installation. The Soviets believed the CIA had a mole inside one of their research institutes. Hale's name surfaced during internal cross-referencing, and from that moment, he was no longer just another foreign operative. He became part of an internal threat assessment. KGB surveillance teams were instructed to shadow him from the moment he entered the country, but not to detain him unless absolutely necessary. Yet something changed on the evening of October 17th. According to one report, a local informant identified Hale leaving a cafe near Kuznetsky Most. He was carrying the same briefcase seen later. In the final photograph, 2 KGB officers followed him on foot. But before they could report back, Hale abruptly changed direction and descended into a narrow alley behind an old printing house. The officers described losing visual contact for no more than 15 seconds. When they exited the alley onto the main square, Hale was gone. Their confusion is evident in the handwritten notes. Subject vanished. No struggle, no immediate contact. Request instructions. The request went unanswered for nearly an hour, an unusual delay considering the importance of the surveillance. By the time orders finally arrived, Protocol 7 had been activated. Protocol 7 was an internal emergency directive that bypassed normal arrest procedures. It could only be initiated by a small circle of senior officials and was used in situations considered too sensitive for ordinary documentation. What triggered its activation? That night remains partially redacted in the surviving files. Some lines are blacked out entirely, replaced only with classification codes. One short, chilling note is visible. Possible hostile interference. Extract evidence immediately. Do not engage foreign assets. CIA analysts reviewing these documents decades later noticed something peculiar. The KGB reports never claimed to have captured Hale. They described tracking him, losing him, and then receiving sudden instructions that seemed unrelated to the surveillance itself, as if another department within the KGB had quietly taken control of the situation. One retired Soviet officer, interviewed in the 1990s, insisted that Hale fell into someone else's hands, though he refused to say whose. His phrasing suggested a unit operating outside the standard KGB structure, perhaps military, perhaps scientific, perhaps something even more compartmentalized. Back in Washington, the CIA struggled to make sense of the silence. Hale's contact inside the Soviet Union had disappeared as well, presumed arrested or executed. The microfilm Hale was meant to retrieve never surfaced, adding another layer of strangeness to the case. By January 1979, the CIA had concluded that either Hale had been eliminated immediately or he was being held in deep isolation. But the truth, as the KGB internally understood it, was far more complex. Hale had not simply been taken. Something else had happened in that alleyway, something that caused the KGB to lock down entire districts of central Moscow for hours and classify the incident at a level higher than most military secrets. And within days, the file on Hale, marked H-17, was sealed so tightly that only 3 people in the Soviet Union were allowed to access it. 2 of them would later die under unusual circumstances. In early November 1978, 3 weeks after Hale's disappearance, an unexpected document surfaced inside the KGB's internal communications network. It was a brief, heavily coded report from a mid-level operative assigned to sweep safe houses across Moscow. The report mentioned an unregistered apartment near Leningradsky Prospect, previously used for covert meetings between Soviet scientists and government liaisons. According to the document, the apartment showed signs of a recent forced entry, a damaged lock, a broken lamp on the floor, and a notebook missing from the desk. The officer noted a faint chemical odor lingering in the air, one he could not identify, but the final line of his report was what drew attention. Foreign subject may have passed through here, uncertain whether voluntarily. That same afternoon, the building was sealed off by men who, according to witness accounts, did not wear KGB uniforms. They removed several boxes and carried out what looked like a portable metal case the size of a briefcase. Residents were told nothing. The report was quietly forwarded to a restricted operations unit and never filed in the standard archive. Only decades later did researchers connect the timing of the apartment sweep with Hale's last known movement. Inside the CIA, analysts had begun reconstructing Hale's behavior in the weeks leading up to his mission. They discovered that he had insisted on choosing his own exit route, had refused backup, and had requested an unusual amount of autonomy for a relatively simple intelligence exchange. Some within the agency began to wonder if Hale had uncovered something unrelated to his official assignment, something that made him deviate from the original plan. But the CIA had no way to confirm it. The Soviets were silent, and Hale's informant had vanished entirely. Meanwhile, inside the KGB, the mystery deepened. A classified transcript from a late-night meeting on October 19th, 2 days after Hale disappeared, captured the growing tension between departments. One colonel argued that surveillance failures had allowed a foreign operative to slip away. Another insisted that Hale had entered an area under the jurisdiction of a special research bureau, one that ordinary KGB teams were not authorized to approach. The deputy chairman overseeing the meeting dismissed both theories and ordered absolute silence on the matter, warning officers that even internal speculation would be considered a breach of national security. The transcript ends abruptly, as if someone purposely terminated the recording mid-sentence. Rumors quickly spread within the Lubyanka building. Some officers whispered that Hale had been captured but not by the KGB, that he had walked into a restricted zone connected to secret weapons research. Others believed he had been killed by mistake during a covert sweep. unrelated to his mission. A small number entertained a more unsettling possibility, that Hale had defected after encountering information too valuable to ignore. But none of these theories aligned perfectly with the strange behavior of senior officials, the sudden activation of Protocol 7, the sealed reports, the unexplained involvement of an unknown department. Years later, one retired lieutenant colonel, interviewed anonymously for a documentary, described what happened that week in cryptic terms. "It wasn't the man they were after," he said. "It was what the man walked into. He saw something he shouldn't have, something we didn't even want our own officers to see." When asked whether Hale had been taken alive, the colonel paused for nearly a minute before answering. "Alive? At first, yes. After that, I don't know. They moved him somewhere we did not control." The CIA's attempts to exchange prisoners in hopes of retrieving Hale were met with consistent refusals. The Soviets denied ever detaining him, maintaining the same official statement for years. There was no record, no arrest, no involvement. Sharp-eyed analysts noted that the phrasing never changed, as if recited from a script. By early 1979, the case was no longer treated as a typical disappearance, but as a matter connected to something larger, a classified Soviet program the CIA had no data on. Hale's file was marked indefinite status, one of the rarest classifications within the agency. It meant they could not confirm whether he was captured, dead, or acting independently. And behind the walls of the KGB, a troubling realization was emerging. Hale had not been the only foreign operative to vanish near facilities tied to the same secret research bureau. His case simply became the most famous because of what he carried in his briefcase and because of what he supposedly saw in the hours before he disappeared. By the spring of 1979, fragments of information about Hale's final hours began to surface inside isolated KGB departments, not through official reports, which remained sealed under Protocol 7, but through quiet conversations, intercepted memos, and the occasional mistake made by overworked clerks. The most telling lead came from a short internal notice issued by the Ministry of Defense, unrelated on the surface to counterintelligence work. It referenced an unscheduled transfer of an unidentified foreign national to a restricted medical facility outside Leningrad on the night of October 18th, though the notice avoided names, dates, and locations. The timing and circumstances aligned perfectly with the disappearance of Thomas Hale. This facility, as later discovered, was not a typical military hospital. It was part of a secret research complex known informally as Sector P, responsible for examining anomalous materials and conducting experiments on advanced detection technologies. Access was so tightly controlled that even high-ranking KGB officers required special approval to enter. Witnesses who worked nearby recalled heavy military transport arriving at the compound around midnight, headlights off, escorted by unmarked vehicles. Soldiers sealed off the surrounding roads for several hours, telling civilians that a training drill was in progress. Those who lived closest reported hearing noises that did not resemble normal operations, metallic strikes, arguments in hushed voices, and at least once, something that sounded like a man screaming before being abruptly silenced. What made the situation even stranger was that, according to internal correspondence discovered decades later, Sector P had not requested any transfer that night. In fact, they protested the arrival of the unidentified foreigner, arguing that they were not equipped to hold or interrogate a prisoner. But the order had come from above, delivered directly from an office, whose signature was later redacted from all documents. The message was simple: hold the subject. Do not speak of this to anyone. Full team arriving soon. Meanwhile, the CIA analysts reviewing Hale's case grew increasingly frustrated. They attempted to reconstruct his final route using satellite imagery and intercepted communications, but gaps remained. It was as if he crossed into a part of Moscow that did not exist on any map. Months later, a double agent inside a Soviet ministry delivered a curious message to the CIA. Your man walked into a place built for silence. Not everyone who enters comes out. When pressed to explain further, the double agent refused, saying only that he feared for his life. Inside the KGB, pressure mounted. Officers began questioning why an ordinary field operative was taken to a facility that typically dealt with classified technologies, not prisoners. One colonel wrote a private note describing the situation as deeply unusual and potentially dangerous for internal cohesion. That note was confiscated, and the colonel was reassigned the following week. Others were warned to avoid discussing the matter entirely. One lieutenant who asked too many questions later died in a car accident on an empty highway near Tula, though officially ruled a mechanical failure. His family believed it was no accident. The clearest clue came from a retired research technician who worked at Sector P in the late 1970s. Decades later, in a confidential interview, he described seeing a foreign man brought into the basement level of the facility shortly after midnight. The man was disoriented, restrained, and appeared to be suffering from shock. The technician never learned his name, but he remembered one detail vividly. The man carried a torn fragment of a notebook page in his hand, refusing to let it go even as guards tried to remove it. The fragment contained handwritten coordinates. The technician recalled that the numbers did not correspond to any location he recognized. Whatever he saw, the technician said, it frightened people on both sides. What those coordinates pointed to, and why Hale had written them down, remained a mystery. But one thing was certain. They were important enough to activate Protocol 7, to involve a facility far outside standard KGB operations, and to trigger a level of secrecy normally reserved for weapons testing or catastrophic accidents. By summer, internal fear grew so intense that even senior officers began distancing themselves from the case. Files disappeared from archives, names were removed from logs, and among those who had seen the truth inside Sector P, a quiet belief took hold. Hale had stumbled onto something the Soviet government had been hiding not from the Americans, but from its own intelligence services. Something so sensitive that even the KGB was not meant to know. And whatever happened next would ensure that the truth stayed hidden for decades. In late 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed and offices across Moscow scrambled to burn or hide sensitive documents, a thin dust-covered folder surfaced in an abandoned archival room of the KGB's 5th Directorate. It bore no name, only the faded marking H-17, almost erased by time. The folder contained just 4 items: a single-page transfer order to Sector P, a blurred photograph of a man in restraints, a top-secret memo with half the text redacted, and a charred fragment of a notebook page with numbers that looked like coordinates. The page matched the exact description given years earlier by the retired technician from Sector P, and though the photo was degraded, CIA analysts would later confirm with 87% certainty that the restrained man was Thomas Hale. The discovery reignited interest in the decades-old disappearance. But by then, many of the people who could have spoken, or dared to speak, were gone. 2 had died under unclear circumstances in the 1980s. Another simply vanished from his apartment, leaving behind an untouched meal and an unplugged television. The technician who had provided the earlier testimony refused further interviews, stating that he had already said too much. What investigators could piece together came mostly from scattered Soviet reports, foreign intelligence archives, and fragments of personal correspondence that somehow escaped destruction. By carefully reconstructing these fragments, a chilling picture emerged. The coordinates Hale wrote down corresponded not to a military installation, but to a forested area near an abandoned early warning radar station northwest of Moscow. The site had been abruptly shut down in 1976 after an unexplained malfunction that caused a citywide blackout in Klin. Rumors at the time spoke of an experiment gone wrong, of equipment behaving in ways its designers could not explain. Officially, the shutdown was blamed on technical inconsistencies. Unofficially, some believed the station was involved in detecting phenomena that did not fit within known physics. Multiple independent testimonies hinted that Hale had somehow entered that restricted zone before his disappearance, perhaps while trying to reach his informant, perhaps by mistake, or perhaps because he discovered something worth risking everything to see. Whatever he found there, the Soviets wanted it buried so deeply that even the KGB was not allowed to know. The activation of Protocol 7 now made sense. It was not about capturing an American spy. It was about containing a leak from a project so classified that only a handful of Soviet officials knew its real purpose. What happened to Hale inside Sector P remains uncertain, but a final declassified note, one of the very last documents surviving the collapse, suggests his condition deteriorated rapidly. The note states, subject unable to speak coherently, exhibits signs of acute neurological stress, repeatedly attempted to warn of signal patterns. No further context was provided. The next line was blacked out with thick marker. Below it, an impersonal administrative order. Transfer concluded. File sealed permanently. The CIA formally closed the case in 1993, citing lack of actionable evidence, but unofficially, several analysts continued to work on it for years. One of them, speaking anonymously in 2004, said that the Hale disappearance was unlike anything in the Cold War, more a science research accident than an intelligence failure. Another added, "We weren't supposed to find him." The Soviets weren't supposed to find him either. That's what makes this different. No body was ever recovered. No conclusive proof of Hale's death was found. Yet among those who handled the surviving Soviet documents, the consensus was grim. Hale never left Sector P alive. If he died there, the details were buried under layers of classification that survived even the collapse of the state that created them. Today, only one thing is certain. Thomas Hale was not simply a spy who vanished in enemy territory. He was a man who walked into the wrong place at the wrong time. A place where military secrecy, experimental research, and Cold War paranoia converged. And when he crossed that invisible line, he stepped into a world neither side was willing to acknowledge publicly. That is why 40 years later, both governments still prefer the simplest explanation: a missing agent, an unsolved case, and a silence that stretches on. Not because the truth is unknown, but because it is far more troubling than either side is willing to admit.